Numbers don't panic, people do. Let's look at the psychology driving today's market. A market forecast can sound precise long before the uncertainty behind it is truly narrow. When professionals keep circling the same number, the agreement can look like clarity rather than compression. The comfort comes from uniformity, not from certainty alone. The opening tension is social as much as analytical. That surface agreement feels reassuring because a tight range looks calmer than an honest spread of possibilities. A narrow band can look firmer than the evidence really is. But a polished consensus can hide how much private doubt still exists behind public confidence. Private hesitation can disappear once the public number hardens. The opening tension is social as much as analytical. The deeper question is not why experts think carefully. It is why their published range can shrink so quickly. The audience sees the cluster before it sees the doubt. If we follow that question, we find a social mechanism sitting beside the analytical one. That is how compression starts feeling like clarity. The opening tension is social as much as analytical. On the surface, public forecasts are just estimates about growth, inflation, earnings, or demand under uncertainty. The forecast is public, but the uncertainty stays partly private. That is what the viewer can recognize in practice. Yet audiences rarely hear the full uncertainty. They usually hear one central number repeated until it starts to feel natural. Repetition makes the central estimate feel more natural than it is. Once that number becomes the reference point, every deviation from it looks bolder than it really is. The reference point gains force once everyone can see it. The signal looks cleaner than it is. The result is a market conversation that can treat narrow agreement as evidence of objectivity by itself. The social cost of distance can outgrow the analytical benefit. That is how attention starts narrowing. Under those conditions, the outlier is judged not only on accuracy but also on how uncomfortable the deviation looks. A cautious outlier can still look reckless inside a tight pack. That is where the stakes change. The professional cost of loneliness can start competing with the analytical value of independence. Professional comparison changes how uncertainty gets presented. The social cost begins to matter. To see the mechanism clearly, separate private judgment from public presentation for a moment. The issue is not intelligence, it is incentive design. That distinction keeps the mechanism visible. A forecaster can privately see wide uncertainty while still feeling pressure to publish a tidy estimate. Publishing cleanly is not the same as thinking independently. That distinction keeps the mechanism visible. Benchmark numbers become magnets because they reduce the visible distance between one analyst and the pack. Benchmarking quietly narrows what feels acceptable to print. That distinction keeps the mechanism visible. That visible distance matters when clients, peers, editors, and colleagues will all compare forecasts side by side. Peers do not need to coordinate for the pressure to work. In an ambiguous environment, social cues become part of the decision process even when nobody says they should. Shared routines can make the center estimate feel unusually sticky. Peer estimates start acting like silent anchors, narrowing what feels professionally acceptable to publish. The pack becomes a reference even before anyone says it aloud. That distinction keeps the mechanism visible. Institutional routines can reinforce that narrowing because meetings, notes, and summaries reward clean comparability. That is why public forecasts can lose visible width so quickly. That distinction keeps the mechanism visible. So the consensus is not always chosen because it is believed most deeply. Sometimes it is chosen because it is safest publicly. The range contracts first in presentation, then in attention. The first step is ordinary uncertainty. The evidence is incomplete, noisy, and open to several defensible interpretations. Uncertainty begins wide, but reputation rewards tidier framing. Each step adds to the same feedback loop. The second step is career asymmetry. Being wrong alone can feel more damaging than being wrong with everyone else. Being wrong alone can look worse than being wrong together. The third step is gentle shading. Estimates drift closer together without anyone needing to coordinate explicitly. Small shifts toward the middle accumulate into a visible cluster. Each step adds to the same feedback loop. The fourth step is appearance. Once the range narrows, outsiders read the narrowness itself as a sign of quality. The cluster then starts validating itself. Each step adds to the same feedback loop. The fifth step is reinforcement. The more credible the cluster looks, the more future estimates begin from that cluster. What looks objective may partly be reputationally convenient. Each step adds to the same feedback loop. The sixth step is positioning. Decision makers may prepare for the central forecast more than for the surrounding possibilities. Positioning often prepares for the center more than the tails. The seventh step is neglect. Wider scenarios remain imaginable, but they stop receiving equal public attention. The missing width becomes the real blind spot. Each step adds to the same feedback loop. The eighth step is self-censorship. A forecaster may still see tail risk yet hesitate to frame it prominently. Tail scenarios stay imaginable while losing public emphasis across the broader crowd. The ninth step is repetition. Each update inherits the previous consensus as its social starting point. People remember the polished range more than the hidden doubt. Each step adds to the same feedback loop. The 10th step is memory. Later observers remember the tidy public band more than the private ambiguity around it. The public band can become tighter than the private mind. This is why benchmark anchoring matters. The reference point is not just informational, it becomes reputational terrain. A benchmark is informational, but it is also social terrain. Each step adds to the same feedback loop. Once reputational terrain forms, even small deviations can feel larger than their analytical merit would justify. Nearness to consensus starts looking prudent. Each step adds to the same feedback loop. Social proof enters quietly because every aligned estimate makes the next aligned estimate feel more defensible. That is where social proof works inside expert circles. Each step adds to the same feedback loop. Institutional process can deepen the effect when smooth communication matters as much as analytical nuance. Institutional polish can conceal analytical narrowing. Each step adds to the same feedback loop. None of this requires manipulation. It only requires incentives that reward professional safety under uncertainty. No conspiracy is required for this effect to appear. Each step adds to the same feedback loop. A fair counterpoint is that similar information can rationally produce similar forecasts. Similar data can still justify some real clustering. That keeps the explanation properly bounded. The explanation needs a boundary here. If everyone is looking at the same data, some clustering is exactly what we should expect. Agreement is not evidence of fear by itself. That keeps the explanation properly bounded. There are also environments where strong dissent is invited, and uncertainty bands are discussed openly. Some teams do invite open uncertainty and wider ranges. That keeps the explanation properly bounded. So clustering alone cannot prove fear, conformity, or bad faith. So clustering alone never proves a hidden motive. That keeps the explanation properly bounded. That keeps the claim properly bounded. Correlation is not evidence of motive, and LLM2 should not pretend that it is. The safer claim is that compression can overstate confidence. That keeps the explanation properly bounded. What matters is the repeated compression of uncertainty into a public number that sounds firmer than the underlying situation. The effect weakens when dissent stays cheap and visible. The mechanism grows weaker when dissent is cheap, scenario ranges are visible, and institutions reward explicit uncertainty. That is why uncertainty language matters so much. That keeps the explanation properly bounded. That brings us back to the opening puzzle. The trap is not simple stupidity or lack of intelligence. The opening puzzle is really about incentives, not competence. This answers the opening question directly. It is an adaptive response to a professional environment where visible deviation can carry a special cost. Capable analysts can still adapt to a narrow public game. This answers the opening question directly. Highly capable analysts can still converge too tightly because the public game differs from the private reasoning process. The blind spot appears when visible dispersion falls too far. The market error appears when the public range gets narrower than the real field of plausible outcomes. What disappears is attention to the broader field of outcomes. This answers the opening question directly. Then the blind spot is not the central number alone. It is the missing width around that number. A surprise can be conceptually possible while publicly neglected. This answers the opening question directly. When a surprise arrives, people call it unexpected even though the broader range was always conceptually available. The wiser analyst keeps the width visible. This answers the opening question directly. What was lost was not possibility itself. What was lost was attention to that possibility. Consensus is powerful when it reshapes what others prepare for. This answers the opening question directly. So the better question is not who guessed the headline number best. It is who kept the uncertainty visible. That is how one number can dominate a conversation. That resolves the puzzle. Forecasts converge tightly because public incentives can reward nearness to consensus more than honest dispersion. The mechanism is social pressure layered onto uncertainty. This answers the opening question directly. From there, the practical takeaway is observational rather than predictive. The tighter public range is the point to study. Use it as a study lens, not a market call. Watch how much attention professionals give to ranges, not just medians or headline estimates. Observation matters more here than prediction. Use it as a study lens, not a market call. Listen for whether uncertainty is being described as alive, unresolved, and genuinely two-sided. Watch whether ranges receive less airtime than medians. Use it as a study lens, not a market call. Notice whether disagreement is treated as useful information or as reputational friction. Useful disagreement is often the most valuable signal. Use it as a study lens, not a market call. Compare the psychological story with structural explanations before reducing the pattern to herd behavior alone. Reputational friction changes what gets published. Use it as a study lens, not a market call. Ask who pays the visible cost of being different, because that cost shapes what gets published. The center of gravity can pull even careful thinkers inward. When consensus becomes the social center of gravity, even independent minds can start orbiting it. That is why behavior can compress uncertainty in view. Behavioral interpretation helps us study that orbit, but it does not reliably predict the next market move. The point is to notice the narrowing, not to trade it. The point is not to trade on consensus. The point is to study how consensus can compress uncertainty in public view. A comfortable number can hide an uncomfortable range. Don't follow the herd, study it. See you next time.